Morning, church. Colossians chapter 1, if you please. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so we'll get rolling quick here. Angela stated that Rick is on his way home, should be back here on Wednesday. Rick is one of our deployed military people, and we're anxious to have him back. Probably not as anxious as Angela, maybe, but we're anxious to have him back here. So, if it seems we're a little off kilter this morning, we got to the church building to discover that there was no water. So it was kind of a crisis for a while there. We weren't sure exactly how we were going to proceed. It's kind of funny, Tim mentioned how we take things for granted so often. And I never even thought about how not having water might derail things. But it's also kind of funny how we see things differently. The adults were all worried about how restroom facilities were going to operate. Carter was worried about whether we were going to have lemonade. So that's church family. Thank God. For those that are visiting with us, it's already been stated we're glad you're here, but I want to reiterate, we are so glad you're here. Hope your travels are safe and that you've been blessed. By your time with us here, you've been a blessing to us. To those folks specifically, I want to say that this sermon this morning is not going to be the norm for me. I don't have an axe to grind. I don't typically preach sermons on this topic. But we are in Colossians and working our way through, and we are to this point. So I'm going to make some points that have to do with the Christian and politics. And I know it's kind of a taboo. We've been fed this idea that we're not supposed to talk about that kind of thing in church. Paul didn't know that. So I'm going to just go ahead and follow Paul's outline and let the chips fall where they may. I challenge you to answer the question, who is this? There's a list of characteristics on the screen there. Founded as an aristocratically led nation. Kind of birthed in intellectualism. With the idea of coming up with a better government. And turned eventually into a republic where citizens were represented by their Senate. They tried to work things that way. It was a challenge. The needs of the common people often were overlooked. There were attempts at reform. This nation grew in power and size, and bureaucracy swelled, and eventually corruption and pandering to special interests began to set in. Taxes continued to spiral out of control to feed the bureaucracy and the corruption. The upstanding were silenced in whatever way necessary. And eventually, with the republic in shambles, the citizens were conditioned to accept the leadership of a strongman savior to restore order, and it came at the expense of liberty. Who am I talking about? Huh? Who said Rome? Rome. Do you see any similarities? Do you see any similarities at all to the nation in which we live right now? In fact, if I had left off this one statement right here, with the Republicans shambles, the citizens conditioned to accept this strongman leader who suspends liberty at the and gives them back their order, and a case could be made that we're here. But But if I left that off, you wouldn't know whether I was talking about Rome or whether I was talking about the United States. There was a condition in the first century that Paul was addressing. The condition in Corinth, the condition in Colossae was these folks were all caught up in Rome's going to fix this for us. Rome was, and you couldn't be a citizen of the world in the first century and not be caught up in the fact that Rome was going to do something. Because if Rome had the sniffles, the whole world had a cold, so to speak. If Rome did anything, it affected everybody. And so there is this mentality among the folks in Colossae that eventually Rome's going to fix this. And after all, at the top of the food chain in Rome are these emperors who have declared themselves to be what? Who said God? That's right. They declared themselves to be God, and they were to be worshipped. Some of them took it more seriously than others. Not all of the emperors felt like they needed to be worshipped necessarily. Nero was one who, he was insane. But I mean, the guy thought he was supposed to be worshipped. So that is why Paul says, and I want you to look with me at verse 15 of Colossians chapter 1. And we've been kind of working our way and unpacking this little section. It is so heavy, and there's so much here. And for those of you who haven't been with us, you can pick up the most of it on the web. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. We talked about that last week. The idea doesn't mean that he was part of the creation and just happened to be the first created. This is talking about his authority. This is talking about the fact that in the human family, this is so big. In the human family, Jesus is the boy that the Father tapped on the shoulder and said, "You are going to run the business." Jesus in the temple when he was 12. "Don't you know," he says to his mother, "what? I must be about my Father's business." That was the statement of the Son that God's going to tap on the shoulder and say, "You have the authority to run my business." So when it talks about him being the firstborn, we're not talking about God creating Jesus, as some folks say. We're talking about the authority. And you know that by the entire context that we're looking at. The context is this. In fact, he's going to go on to say that he created everything. Well, if he was a created thing, does that make sense? That he couldn't create everything? So, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation, for by him all things were created. Things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by him and for him. He is before all things. My voice is giving me fits. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. In him all things hold together. He is in the process, Paul says, of holding everything together. You say, it doesn't look like he's holding everything together. Everything's falling apart. And therein lies the rub. That's exactly what the church at Colossae was dealing with. Everything looked like it was falling apart. Rome was in shambles. And I won't go into all of the history, but I do need to say that that there has always been, and bear with me for just a minute, I'm going to talk history for just a second, and as soon as I say the word history, it's so funny, because as soon as I say the word history, I see people looking for the pillows and kind of settling back and getting ready for a little snooze. So there will be a quiz at the end of this. It doesn't matter whether you're dealing with religion or whether you're dealing with politics. There's always going to be a struggle between the idea of law and liberty. John Dennis's own struggle consistently over the last 25 years has been, how do you balance the idea of setting people free from law and what typically happens when that happens? When you set folks free from law, what typically happens? I mean, it's just like the old rubber band that breaks and goes off into oblivion. So, this is not going to be a discussion on law and liberty per se, but I need to set something up here, so just bear with me for a minute. In 1983, Time celebrated 60 years, and this was the magazine. And I have tried to find that. I mean, I know I can get it on eBay and places like that, but there's an amazing article, an essay in the opening pages of that magazine right there. I won't bore you with all the details, but listen to the tone of the article. It starts out with this statement: the atom was unsplit, and so were most marriages. Now, listen to the correlation. The idea that technology hadn't split the atom yet, and marriages were still pretty much intact, was a pretty astute statement by Time in 1983. And then Time goes on to say that in order for us to understand what's happened in the last 60 years, we need to get a sense of the prevailing winds, or the word they use is to discover the idea that characterized our age. And they go on to say, behind most of these events lay the assumption, now watch this, because this is so critical to what we are dealing with in the here and now. Behind most of these events lay the assumption, almost the moral imperative, that what was not free ought to be free, that limits were intrinsically evil. In this article, they set up the idea that it has become, in 1983, it had become the American doctrine that anything that restrained you was a sin. That anything that held you back, that anything that controlled you in any sense of the term was a bad thing, because Americans are supposed to be what? Free. And so we rebelled against all restraint, didn't we? And chaos followed. They ended, the guy that wrote this article, and I love this statement, he ends the article with this statement: when people or ideas are unfettered, they are freed, but not yet free. You realize that in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve made a decision to free themselves of God's restraints. And they have been a slave ever since. We were born into a world of slavery. And our culture is imprisoned. And you don't have to be Einstein to see this, guys. We are imprisoned by so many things. So how do you keep freedom from becoming chaos? That's a pretty good question. And I don't have time to unpack this completely, but I'm just going to throw this out there for you guys. There are two poles: totalitarianism. You could name as many totalitarianistic governments as I can. In fact, what we call the Arab Spring that we're seeing taking place over in the Middle East is one nation after another saying we've had it with totalitarianism. We've had it with the dictators. Good dictators, bad dictators, it doesn't matter. Dictators all the same, and very little freedom. On the other end of that is chaos. There is a moral imperative. Those who study society, sociologists say, there's a moral imperative. Society will not very long permit chaos to reign. It will impose law. You see the play between law and liberty? If we say, I'm free, I can do whatever I want to, eventually what happens is society steps in and says, well, no, you're not free to do whatever you want to. So, by the way, there was a book on the previous slide called The Great Evangelical Disaster. Guys, I don't do this very often, but I'm just going to tell you. It's by a guy by the name of Francis Schaeffer. You would do yourself an enormous favor to pick up Francis Schaeffer's book, The Great Evangelical Disaster, and read it cover to cover. Because it is unbelievably pointed right at what we're experiencing in our culture right now. And basically what Francis Schaeffer says is the reason that our culture has had amazing freedom, you don't find any other culture on the surface of this earth for the last 1,000 years. You don't find a nation with the kind of freedom that we've had, Schaeffer says, ever. And he says there's a reason. The reason that we were able to balance liberty and law, do you guys know why? Why the United States was able to balance law and liberty was because it began in the context of an allegiance to a higher authority than law itself, a higher authority than written law. Basically, it said, you don't need to write a law to restrain me. I'm going to be restrained because I pledge allegiance not primarily to the flag. I pledge allegiance to what? To Jehovah God Almighty, who gave everything that flag stands for. I'm certainly okay with pledging allegiance to the flag. But my point is that, and I'm not one of those folks who believes that every person in politics and at the beginning of the United States, we're all Christians. I know that's not the case. But I also know that the majority of the folks who occupied this land to begin with were here with one thing in mind, and that was not freedom to do whatever they wanted to, but freedom to what? Worship. However they felt that God was calling them to worship. Which means that the majority of the folks that were here were restrained not by written law, but by what? The moral imperative that Jesus has over us. So in a situation like that, where you've got people who say, you don't need to write a law for me. I'm already controlled by Jesus. You can cut those people loose and give them what? All sorts of freedom. But as soon as you remove this from the equation and say, oh man, anything that restrains me is a bad thing, church is a bad thing because it proposes this idea of restraint, you remove the very organ from the body that produces the effect that we're looking for, the effect of restrained individuals. And so here's what happens. As soon as this moral restraint was removed, what steps in to fill the void? Well, that's right. Government steps in to fill the void. So the government says we need to be bigger to control these folks who are out of control. So we've got to write more laws, and more laws, and more laws. You guys made it through that amazingly well. Last slide. Folks, we've got two options in front of us. We can fight gators or we can drain the swamp. I remember hearing about a guy who made the statement. In fact, I've heard people say this from time to time. I'll say, how are you doing? And they'll say, I'm so busy fighting gators, I don't have time to drain the swamp. The truth of the matter is, if you could get the swamp drained, what would happen? Gators would go someplace else. So, here's the thing. We've got two options. We can fight gators or we can drain the swamp. Fighting gators, to some extent, on some occasions, may seem a little easier than getting in there and draining the swamp. The fight gator approach is to elect the right people, and Washington will fix this. Guys, I just heard somebody whisper, it'll never happen. In Washington, if we get the right people elected, then they'll put the right laws out there and they'll get us back on moral ground. Right? Why do you guys look at me like I'm lying to you? If we pass the right laws, people will do the right thing. We'll rely on law, and law will fix it. So the summary of the fight the gators or drain the swamp, the summary of the fight the gators approach is Washington will get us back to Jesus. And I hear this all the time. If we just get the right folks elected, then the country will, we'll get back to where it's supposed to be. Guys, I believe we need to be involved in politics. I need to state this clearly because this will be on the web. And I'll get all sorts of email about this. I think that every one of you in here needs to be rabidly involved in politics. But I need you to understand that at the end of the day, politics at its very best is about coming up with a compromise between two opposing ideas. At its very best, it's about compromise. And the New Testament doesn't give us an awful lot of room to compromise. Jesus said, I'm one of the ways. No, I misquoted that. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, not a bringer. This is so critical that we understand this. He didn't say, I came to bring you truth. That's what separates him from all of the other religious folks out there in the history of this planet. They said, we've come to bring you truth. Jesus steps up and says, what? I am the truth. That's right. So it doesn't give us an awful lot of room to compromise. Do I think we need to be fighting in Pierre and fighting in Washington, D.C. for family and all of those things and smaller government? You better believe it. But that's fighting alligators, guys. The drain the swamp approach, it's a little bit more complicated. My proposal is that we're not Republicans or Democrats, that we are of the party of the Nazarene. And we've already got our guy. We don't have to do any polling. We don't have to check the winds of sentiment. Pretty much sure I know who I want running the show. Paul says, Colossians chapter 1, verse 15 and following, He created everything. He has all authority. Does that ring any bells? Does it sound like anything else you've heard him say? You remember him on his way out, Matthew chapter 28. He says, all authority has been, what? Given to me. Washington says, well, we don't recognize his authority. Yeah, well, guess what? All you have to do, and I don't have time to do that this morning, but you read Jeremiah 18, where Jeremiah is taken to the potter's house, and God says, I'm going to show you something. You go to the potter's house and you watch, and you guys remember the story is Jeremiah watched the potter and the wheels turning and the pottery's taking shape, and then it says that it was marred in his hand. And what did the potter do? Huh? Who said squished it? Did somebody say squished it? That, you have to know Hebrew, but that's what it says. It just says he squished it and started all over again. That's right. He squished it and started all over again. And then the moral of the story is this. God says. We were talking, by the way, about Old Testament, New Testament. Here's a principle to back up what Marvin said this morning in Bible class. Here's a Here's an everlasting principle found in the Old Testament. God says, I'll do whatever I want to with the nations. If they do what I want them to do, I'll bless them. That's that balance that we talked about a little while ago. It's just built into the way the universe works. You bring yourself... No, now listen, I didn't say you bring other people. I said you bring yourself into submission to the authority of Jesus Christ. God has a way of blessing those kinds of things. But if you as a nation rebel, he says, I'll do with you whatever I want to do with you. I am so tired of being tired of hearing God's people in the United States talk like the United States is the core, as the crowning achievement of Jehovah God Almighty. The United States is not God's crowning achievement. The cross of Jesus Christ is God's crowning achievement. Would I love to see my nation come out from under the mess that it's in? You better believe it. But it's not going to happen because we're throwing darts at one another and calling each other names, and that's not going to fix this. Step number 1 is going to be personally submit to the rule of Christ. That means John Dennis stops worrying about what Brother Hunter's thinking and doing, and he brings his life into submission to the rule of Jesus Christ. Why? Because, work with me, all authority has been given unto him in heaven and on earth. You say, well, he's not forcing his authority on anybody. What's the final word in that sentence? Yet. He's not forcing his will on anybody yet. But Paul says in several places, at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in Romans. And in other places, every knee shall bow. All authority has been given unto him in heaven and on earth. Therefore, John Dennis, submit. Voluntarily. Yeah, but Father, Tim, just worry about John Dennis. That's step number 1. Step number 1 is personally submit to the rule of Christ. Step number 2 is for God's people to bring all things into the submission of Jesus Christ. You say, how do we do that? One heart at a time. You say, that doesn't seem like it'll happen very fast. You'd be surprised how fast it would happen. If God's people got serious about, first off, being in submission themselves, and then secondly, bringing everything else around them into the submission to Christ. It doesn't look like he's holding all things together. Well, let me tell you this. In the universe in which we live, there's only one tiny little sector that's not currently in submission. Everything else is in perfect submission to him. I mentioned a few weeks ago the mourning dove that nested in the tree not too far from our house. That absolutely drives me insane. It sounds like a lot of people I know just whining all the time. Just whoo-hoo. Stuck my head out the window and I said, would you stop it? And he said, God told me to do this for his glory. And I'm thinking, That's dumb, but I mean, that's what God said do. I guess you should do it. Everything in the entire universe is doing exactly what God said do, except for what? People. So, if you look at it from the sense that there's only one tiny little sector in the entire universe that's still in rebellion, He's doing a pretty good job of holding things together. He's going to finish it. This passage that we're in, and we'll finish this up in a few weeks, talks about an ongoing reconciliation. He's in the process of reconciling. He's in the process of reconciling everything to Himself. I don't know what it's going to look like when He's done, but I can't wait. In conclusion, one of the strange things about Jesus and His teachings are how paradoxical and counterintuitive that they often are. In order to put the end of the fight, you turn the other cheek. Well, that's not really my first thought. Am I the only one in here who thinks that's kind of counterintuitive? But if you've ever tried that, in fact, I was talking to Caleb the other day about a situation when I was in, some of you guys have heard me tell the story, and I won't belabor the point, but big old huge monstrosity guy in my auto mechanics class when I was in high school, and he always would roll up the red rag and pop our leg when we were under the car on the creeper, which would evoke a couple of things. There'd be an immediate ouch in the leg where he would pop us, and then there would be another immediate ouch in the forehead where we would sit up and hit our head on the muffler or whatever it was, So, and this guy was like, he's what we call the knuckle dragger. You guys know what that, he was just not totally evolved kind of a guy, just this big, huge monster. And everybody was afraid of him. So I had this idea one day in auto mechanics class. He came into the men's room to smoke a cigarette. And while he wasn't looking, I lit his pants on fire. And that I thought was a good idea at the time. But the problem with that is that he was an equal opportunity persecutor before that event. And then afterwards, he was totally focused on me. So on the surface, the idea of turning the other cheek doesn't make an awful lot of sense. And yet, when you start exploring the idea of how successful lighting Mathis's pants on fire actually was for me, maybe turning the other cheek might have worked a little better than I thought. And I won't finish that story, but my point is that so often it's counterintuitive what Jesus teaches. He says, in order to get up, you got to go down. In order to really live, you got to die. Now watch this. It says, in order to be free, take my yoke. What's a yoke? That's what oxen wore. It's what a slave would have worn. In order to be free, if you really want to be free, take my yoke. That takes us right back to that second slide. You really want to be free? Bring yourself into submission to the Christ. Jim, lead us in the invitation song.